All right. Well, welcome everyone to ARM 54, Risk Management Principles and Practices. This is our first session, first class session that we'll be doing in a series. This course will take approximately 10 weeks to complete. Now, one of the things we'll do as far as the first class, as this is going to be recorded, we both have live participants and we also have participants that are that will be using the webinar format or the recorded format on YouTube to be able to view the sessions here. But at any point in time during the class, you can certainly email me as well, and I can answer question after hours to be able to help you out, as well as if you need help on a phone call or something like that, I can do it that way as well. So let's get some logistics out of the way. So first off, one of the big challenges is scheduling the exam. And this is where there's sometimes confusion with the institutes and how they do some of these classes here. So you'll notice when you probably purchased your book, you had to pick a window, and you may have seen a screen that looks something like this. So this is the most recent window that they have available. But the reality is you can take your test at any time. The main reason for the window that they have is to make sure that you're using the right textbook. And so they have updated the textbook, and we are now in the 3rd edition. And so that's partly the reason for the window is how long they'll use the other exam to where you can do both exams, take either one of the exams, either the 2nd edition or the 3rd edition. And the main thing that you'll see on there as well is that the registration deadlines, depending on when you register, the early registration and standard registration, there is a pretty significant price difference. So the early on that you decide that you're going to take your exam, you'll save about $75 or $70 or $80 there to be able to do that. And there are Prometic test centers on the Institute's website. You can certainly locate those as well. So one issue is the cost. Obviously, you can take that, and you can cancel. It does say below, and then you have a cost of transfer, and you do forfeit some dollars by doing the cancellation. Now, as far as the exam itself, the exam is an 85 multiple choice question exam, and you have 2 hours to complete it. I am sorry to say that ARM 54 is actually the hardest of the 3 exams to get your designation. 55 and 56 have closer to about an 80% pass rate. Part of the reason with ARM 54 is a little more challenging is it because it does focus a little bit more on enterprise risk, not your traditional risk management area, as well as some of the financial risk aspects. And so when we get to chapters 10 and 11, that's typically where, or 9, 10, 11, where I kind of tend to lose some people. A question always comes up about taking the segmented exams. It's somewhat of a double-edged sword. For ARM 54, I typically don't recommend doing the segmented exam. And here's the reason why. Is when you do the overall exam, if you take it all at once, you have 85 questions, and as long as you get a 70% on the exam, you're going to pass, right? That's a passing rate. And so when people do the segment exam, they typically do pretty well in segment A and segment B. The hard part is segment C. And the reason why is that you still have to pass with 70%. But if you aren't very good at the math in chapter 10, it's a little bit less forgiving. So if you completely bomb chapter 10 and you take the entire exam, you could probably still pass. Whereas if you're only taking the 3 chapters, that is part of the segment C, or might be 4 chapters on that one, and you might get a lower score. And that's typically what I've seen is closer to a 50% or 60% pass rate when people only do the segment C exam. They do pretty good on segment A and B, but that C segment is a little bit more challenging for folks. So the questions themselves as well on all multiple choice, I mentioned that 85, about 60 of the questions are what I would call straight multiple choice. It's going to be asking you a specific question with maybe it's a definition, or you'll have the choices, and it's fairly straightforward. The other 25 are what I call scenario based, meaning that they're going to give you a hypothetical or some background information. A lot of times there's noise in that background information that you don't need, that doesn't add any value, and you have to be able to decipher some of that, but it's still going to be a multiple choice. The other thing is that the questions do not build upon themselves, so that is always a plus as well, that each question really does stand on its own. A prior answer is not going to dictate some of that. So let's go through some of the test taking strategies as part of that. So how do you want to study the material? So my suggestion, read the educational objectives and the course guide before reading the text, okay? So before each chapter, and you'll see that when we do this today, there's gonna be a listing of educational objectives. And it also typically has some terms and phrases that you wanna know. There's text exhibits, and at the end is a chapter summary. And all the questions on the exam are gonna be based upon the educational objectives. And it'll say explain, compare, describe, and each one of those words has a certain meaning, and I'll show you what that means and a little bit later on, because there is actually a test glossary that you can use on there. Actually, I'm going to show you that now. So, so if you look on here, what you're going to see is this is from the Institute, so I can send this out to everyone. It says how to prepare for the Institute exams, and it has what each educational objective begins with one of the following action words. What is the level of understanding required for the exam? So apply, put to use in a practical purpose, analyze. You can see each one of these words, and you'll see one of these words in front of every single educational objective. So that's where that comes from. All right. Now, optional is I put course guide, review questions, and there's also application questions, or that for some people, they buy the entire packet for what material that you need to study for the exam. Typically, I just recommend the textbook in this course. You can buy the additional stuff from the institutes, the course guide, and other things. It just helps provide structure. The one thing I typically do not recommend is buying the practice exam questions from the institutes. And the reason why is that I found that they actually don't really test on the material that's on the exam, and it kind of goes in the weeds a little bit too much. And so I've had more people complain about those, the practice exam from the institutes when using those. What I do mention is the KEIR guide. I think it's KEIR guide, or KEIR Systems. And they do have practice exams that probably mirror, and in some questions, probably almost identical questions of what you'll probably see on the exam. And also they give you the reason why the question is, or the answer is correct, and why the other ones are not. So that's helpful as well. All right, some other studying tips. So have an answer for all educational objectives. We already talked a little about that. You want to review the exhibits. And what I mean by the exhibits, it's the pictures or figures. Most of the important elements of the material is going to be actually displayed in a figure. And if you can explain what's going on in that picture or that table, that really shows that you understand the material, and that's what they're looking for. Use the same terms and phrases. I think for most of us that are doing this or have done this in the past, we have our day job and we know what the lingo that we use and how we've done risk management. Unfortunately, you got to do what the textbook says is what the answer is. And so as I put in there, if the text has 4 pre-law schools and 6 post-law schools, then so do you. This, again, there is memorizing some content, not a whole lot. It's really how do you apply the material, but really you don't want to create any two examples there. Use acronyms to keep the list separate. So there's different ways to learn some of that. Also, test taking strategy. Test questions frequently interchange information. So when you do get to the point that you are actually going to be taking the exam, what you'll find is that question, maybe you don't know the answer to question 5 in the very beginning, but by the time you get to question 20, there might be some information in there that jogs your memory. So there might be some information that helps give you the definition or description to make you remember something. And they typically say no ARM54 the best. Even though each course does stand on its own, they all kind of build off of 54, the concepts that are in this course as well. Oh, the one thing I forgot before I'll go back here, that anything that's in a list, and you'll see lots of things in the textbook where there's bullet points or there's a list. Typically, anything as a list is something that you want to probably highlight because that's typically where there's questions. And so when we talk about benefits of risk management to an organization. There's a whole list of things in there. And same thing with economy. There might be 9 things for one and 3 in the other. Those are things typically you're going to want to take a look at as well. So how are we going to do this over the next 10 weeks? So tonight, obviously we're doing a little basic background, but we're also going to do chapter 1, which is Introduction to Risk Management. Week 2, we'll talk about risk management standards and guidelines. Oops, I have 2 week 2s and also hazard risk on there. Week 3, operational financial risk management. 4, you can see everything that's on there. But basically, our plan is that the shorter chapters, like next week is chapters 2 and 3. We'll get through both of those, and there'll be another week where we do 2 chapters with a goal of actually by week 9, right around middle of beginning of December, that we will have all the main content done. And then week 10, we'll just do a course review of what are some of the highlights or the main things you want to know from that. If you can't make a class, for those who are doing live, obviously you can rewatch any of these weeks at any point in time. It's going to be on demand. So let's get right down into it and talk a little bit about the introduction to risk management, our very first chapter. And as I mentioned, one of the main things we need to ensure as we start each chapter is look at what the educational objectives are. So what our focus will be on for the next hour or so, we'll explain how the risk management environment is evolving. Next one, explain how risk management benefits both an organization and the economy. Summarize various objectives and goals for organizations to manage risk. Explain how risk management, basic risk measures apply to the management of risk. Explain how classifying and categorizing risk help an organization meets risk management goals. And finally, compare the concept of enterprise risk management and traditional risk management. Now, if you notice, most of those say explain. And so that's basically understanding the basic concepts is really what we're looking for. Summarize, that's something when it says summarize, it's more that you're going to have to memorize things. It's more of a list format. So you want to summarize what the learnings are, and that's where it's going to the goals and objectives. That's typically because it's a list format. And then finally, the last one, compare the concepts. We are obviously be able to compare the difference between enterprise risk management and traditional risk management, because you will get a question most likely that looks at which one of these describes enterprise risk management and which one describes traditional risk management. So that's how you want to use these educational objectives as we go through the class. So risk management environment. And also, again, lesson or how I do these classes is I do try to make sure that the topics actually align with the textbook and the flow of it. As I mentioned, this is the 3rd edition textbook. There really isn't that much difference between the 2nd and the 3rd, but what they did do is they rearranged the format and some things, and they deleted some other areas. So it's not that it's so much different, but they tried to reflect some of the changes in ISO 31000, 2018, as well as in the COSO framework. I'm on the US TAG, Technical Advisory Group for the United States, ANSI, and was part of the rewrite of the latest ISO 31000 standard. So pretty familiar with it, and we can talk a little bit more about that, the details as we go along in this first class here. Okay, so risk management. First thing can be difference between invisible threat that vanishes quickly or whose gravity that has global impacts. And I think we've seen, if you look obviously in our world today, of the different impacts, climate change might be, people say invisible, that it may not have an effect in some areas, but also it could have global impacts. And with the floodings and fires that we see in California, those type of things certainly are part of that. But there's also a lot of risks that are out there that may, they're invisible. We don't know about them. We haven't really thought about them yet, maybe. And so, we go about our business, and so some things can be just fine, but one day maybe that event finally does happen to where it does have a certain impact on our organization or on a certain system. So, part of what we can do as part of the risk management environment is implement a number of controls to mitigate some of those risks. But decisions to implement those are really going to be based on the level of uncertainty within the program there. Excuse me, got a cough tonight. Now, one of the things I don't like about the new textbook, I'll just say it openly, is that they didn't actually define what risk is. And they don't do that till about page 27 in the textbook. And so, but they gave a clue here about the level of uncertainty. So based, if you use the ISO standard, what that basically is that risk is defined as the effect of uncertainty on objectives. And so when you think about that, you know, if you're going to play the lottery or bet like blackjack, the best game of risk really is gambling. And how a person plays is based upon the level of certainty of what they have in their hand and whether they think they can win. And the thing is the less uncertain we are about the risk associated with something that we don't know the cards, or we don't know, we'll use, let's say, tariffs, as an example that are being issued, those type of things. It makes it much harder to make decisions to implement, as well as to put certain controls in place. So what we really have to do is understand uncertainty. And as we go through the course, you're going to see a lot of focus on decision-making and really uncertainty, and how do we make sure we meet our objectives. So all those concepts are really tied together. Now, the other concept that's evolved in the risk management environment is that we have now inexpensive data gathering technology. And also we talk about machine learning, predictive analytic techniques that we can transform data. And what that is doing is allowing us to make better decisions. In some cases, the computers are making decisions for us. And if you think about, 10 years ago or 15 or even 20, right, we had a lot of data, but weren't able to do things with it. Now we have data that has, if you think about facial recognition, we have data on our cars. We know it can tell us our mileage. If on your phones now, Google can tell you on your maps where you've been. All that type of thing provides data, how long you've been to certain places. And so whether it's for marketing purposes or risk purposes, you can use that data to really make much better decisions. And so really the innovations, the next evolution of this is that hopefully we can predict, losses from occurring and prevent them from happening in the first place based upon having better data. That's really, we talk about the big point, and one of the reasons why they updated the book was really to talk about technology and how this is reshaping in the risk management field and insurance to actually do more predictions. The other thing that's happening is we have more data, as an example, in the environment, and let's say climate change, is that we also have insurers in California especially, and I live in Northern California, that are using images from satellites much more, and for property coverage, and looking and saying, oh, you have too many trees around your property, we're going to cancel coverage for on you unless you clean that up, or we might have too many insureds in that area. So they're using data much better. The downside of that is a lot of my neighbors are getting their insurance canceled in the last couple of years because of the fire risk. So climate change, all this thing, data is making the insurance companies to make better decisions because they don't want to have large losses as part of that. So the other part of the evolution of risk and risk management in general, and we'll talk more about this later on, is how we've evolved in risk management. Traditional risk management, probably up until about 15, 20 years ago, was really associated with accidental losses, or what we probably consider insurable risk, right? It's either you had an injury or you had maybe a financial loss, and you can insure on those type of things. But the reality is that most risk cannot be insured. If you look at operations, I think it's a Forbes article, I'll have to find it here and send it out, many years ago, basically said only about 40% of an organization's risk can be insured. So think about when we talk about reputational risk or operational risk from a process. There's certain things that might happen in an organization that they're going to lose money, and you can't get insurance to basically back it up. The other thing to consider when we think about traditional risk management is all that insurance does is replace the financial aspect of a loss. It doesn't prevent the losses from the operations of non-production, right? So you lose that portion. And so if we go look at enterprise risk management, it's really looking at much broader. as much as it talks about as a holistic view. And we want to look at all potential risks, both internal and external. So a lot of times, traditional view is we look at workers' comp, general liability, property, we look at the possibility of fire, those type of things of happening. Under this holistic view, now we're looking at, well, what's going on with politics? Who's going to get elected? We look at the labor market, where we locate our operations. Do we have enough human capital that can support it? All those type of things are part of that. Having worked for Google, one of the big things from an enterprise view most people may not relate to is, why do they have all these buses and all this food and all that? It's actually very much an enterprise risk management decision. For those that know Northern California and the Bay Area, the cost to buy a home or even to rent is quite expensive. And so what happens is that if someone wants to work for Google or any of those in Silicon Valley, they're not going to be able to find a place where they can actually live, and they're going to have to live on the outskirts. And traffic is already bad, so what Google does, they have over 200 buses, and they actually bus in over about 8,000 employees a day. So that's a huge amount of people that they're taking off the roads, but it also allows them to get the human capital they need to continue their operations. Under enterprise risk management also includes potential positive consequences. So there is an upside to risk. We'll talk more about that later as well. And the reality is risk management, taking risk is necessary for growth. You can't have innovation without taking some risks. So whether it be in a laboratory, those type of things, there's always going to be some type of risk. The issue is, what's your risk appetite? How much are you willing to take? And what your tolerance for that risk is, or that uncertainty as well, is part of that. So the other aspect of that is also the high level categories of risk. And you'll see quadrants as we go a little bit later. But typically we put risk in now these 4 areas: hazard, operational, financial, and strategic. And within there, sometimes we can have risks associated with a project, or maybe on the compliance side, it might be financial reporting or certain processes. So if you think about, if you have a major project for your organization that you're trying to work on, or maybe it's a building, a construction project, that would certainly fall as a subcategory risk. And then processes, what are internal processes that can expose us to risk? Again, looking at technology, one of the big issues now is cybersecurity and privacy. So what are the processes to ensure that personal information is not released out? And then finally, there's a definition they provide in the book where it talks about risk profile. And the idea is that there's a certain set of characteristics that are going to be common to all risks in the portfolio. And so if you think about the tech industry, there's a certain risk profile for tech. If you're in a municipality or government agency, you're going to have a certain set of risks, and that becomes your risk portfolio. And there's certain characteristics that are going to be common to all those that they're going to be exposed to. And you can kind of have that as a baseline. All right, so let's move on a little bit. Technology and the changing risk management environment. So one of the major changes to the textbook was this focus on technology. And and how it can be used, and really where is it going. And so one of the traditional techniques they talk about is RCA, or root cause analysis. And part of root cause analysis is the idea that you look backwards, right? You try to identify all the root causes. And sometimes there's different techniques for that. You can ask, why did this happen? The 5 whys and all those things. But the problem is something's already bad has happened, and we're going to look back and try to figure out how to make it not happen again. Now, with technology, hopefully we can take some of those lessons learned and use some of that with risk management, and hopefully provide insights of some of that data that we have and actually make better decision making. And so again, the focus is, how do we do that? Well, part of that is data capture. Where are we getting data now? Now, for the most part, most of us are used to using Excel or some type of spreadsheet and loss runs, and that's how we would typically get most of our data. But the reality is now we have data from so many different sources, and it's almost too much data. And what do we do with it? So now we have smart products that are out there. So they describe it as an innovative item that uses sensors, wireless sensor networks, data collection, transmission, and analysis to further enable item to be faster, more useful, or otherwise improve. Right? Smartwatches. Right? There's in your home now. So if anyone has like a thermostat or like a Nest or some of the other type of thermostats out there, there's sensors that can monitor, the current temperature, the outside temperature, when you're home, when there's activity in the house, those type of things, and then actually compare your usage to others. And so it's collecting information about you and potentially oxygen levels and CO2 and all those things. And so there's all this different equipment out there, all the cameras that we see, especially in other countries where they use facial recognition, and they use a lot of cameras for crime prevention, where they can track, certain people or identify threats. That's part of it as well. So part of that, we now have these, again, smart products, temperature of the body, heart rate, all those things become part of that. The other aspect, Internet of Things, right? So now we also have the ability, because we're all connected, that all these objects are constantly transmitting data to computers. In many cases, it's real-time data. So you can see what's going on and different activity. And so some of the examples, again, wearables, drones, robots, sensors, and I would include cameras in here. People can actually go on their computer and see what's going, if they have a camera around their house, they can see what's going on. They can see someone rings the doorbell and let them in. All those type of things, even though they might not think about risk management, they all provide data that can be useful for someone to actually make better decisions. The other aspect is data storage, right? So one thing that's definitely changed is now we can, store data in the cloud, right? The idea that before everyone had to manage on servers, or if you think about, your first phone, you could maybe take a little bit of pictures and you store them. And the idea of having a gigabyte of data, 10 years ago was unthinkable. Now almost everyone has, 32 gigs of data on their phones to store pictures and things like that. Well, that's even not becoming enough. And so now we have data storage. So we have that aspect. And also the ability to share that data in real time with others to actually be able to use it. The other concept that's discussed quite a bit, and I would expect a question on the exam on this, is about blockchain and what blockchain is and what it does and how it can be used. So as it describes, it's a virtual distributed ledger that maintains a dynamically update list of data records, what they call blocks. And the idea that, these records, they're not recorded in the ledger until the veracity of the data is confirmed and it's verified, right? So the idea that you're always going to have this data, this blockchain, again, distributed ledger from banking standpoint, all that. This is also where you get Bitcoin and all those kind of things. But blockchain allows for sharing of verified quality data and is known for security, transparency, and scalability. So if I was expecting a question on the exam, what are some of the benefits of blockchain? Security, transparency, scalability. Those are typically the types of questions you'll see, or things like that of why would you want to use some of these things and be able to explain it. Data analytics. So data can also now, the changing environment, can be organized and analyzed through methods that use artificial intelligence, such as machine learning and data modeling. Again, technology allows for automated decision-making for improved accuracy and efficiency. You have large volumes of data. You can look at new relationships in data. You can do text mining and also develop new products. Again, for those that have not know that much about this area, the idea of machine learning or artificial intelligence, most of the phones now have a thing where it's anticipating what you're typing based upon what you've typed before. All those things, that's what machine learning is. And as time goes on, it continues to learn. One of the things that, even though it was a game, but I encourage you to take a look at this, was Google the search, Google Go. And this was a game that it's the hardest game in the world, supposedly. And they actually had a computer learn the game. They didn't teach it the rules like IBM, but it eventually learned over time and was actually able to beat a human for the first time. And so that was, and it kept on learning how to be better and using old information how other players were doing it and things like that. So it actually learned on its own. The other thing, trying to think of the name of the company now, but there's a lot of artificial intelligence companies that now are on the brink, and they're also now merging with biotech companies. And so we're going to see a lot of things in here. But the main thing, technology, what is the technology allowing us to do now? Automating decision-making, organizing the large volumes of data, and also the relationships in there is really the big benefit. So I mentioned before, figures are really important when we start looking at the exam. And so this really captures what we just discussed, is how big data has transformed risk management. Data capture, you have Internet of Things and sensors, which then goes into data storage, cloud computing, and blockchain. Now we have analytics, machine learning, artificial intelligence, which then leads that the traditional risk management decisions are now enhanced through the insights derived from that big data. So all that text that we just read, if you can understand this, this is what's most likely to be on the exam, because it does ask the objectives of being able to explain how technology and the risk management environment have changed. So some of the things that I actually include in the text still, even though it's not in the original or in this edition, because I think it's good basic learning that everyone should still know. And so we talk about the benefits of risk management. One of the main benefits, it helps address systemic risk, right? If we understand, we talk about systemic risk, mortgage industry, oil prices, tariffs, things like that. If we understand those areas, we can really help us manage our own organizations. Again, whether public sector, private sector, all those things will help us address systemic risk. And a good example about systemic risk is in Peter Senge's book, The Fifth Discipline. So if you really want a hard book to read, The Fifth Discipline is it. Recommend book on tape. But in there, they talk about a beer game. And without going into too much detail on it, but the idea is that within a system for distribution, you have the retail store, and then you have the manufacturer, and you have the distribution network. And if these things aren't all in sync, based upon production of knowing what's going on in the organization, you can have overproduction on both sides and not having enough product in the retail store. And the idea being that you have a new product going gangbusters, the person orders it, doesn't come in, so he orders more, triples order it, and then the manufacturer starts keeping up with production. Well, then they start overproducing. At the same time, the guy keeps ordering it because they don't have enough, or actually it's not coming in, so on back order. And so they think they're really having a lot of big sales, and the end of the result is they have too much inventory. So really simplified version of it, but definitely take a look at The Fifth Discipline. That'll give you some context. And then the idea of systemic risk. Why should we be looking at? It really has potential for major disruption. You can affect an entire market or financial systems, right? Mortgage industry, that's what we had in 2008, 2009. Oil prices certainly have an impact. We've seen that now as well with, how it's impacting an energy sector as a whole. Natural gas production is higher than coal production, those things. And now all the discussion of tariffs, right? All this creates a systemic risk that organizations have to deal with, especially for global organizations. They'll have to deal with that much more. Actually, an example of systemic risk on tariffs. I have a friend that's actually going to be buying a fridge. And one of the things they found out now is because of the tariffs, there's actually about an 8-week delay in getting delivery because of the tariffs and trying to figure that thing out. So, again, it might be something small, or how does it really impact, that they are starting to see the impact of the tariffs in manufactured goods like fridges and things like that coming over. So what are other benefits of risk management for organizations? And we're going to go through each one of these in a little bit more detail as well. So, the first one, reduce cost of hazard risk, right? That's somewhat a no-brainer. That's really the insurable risk. Hopefully, if we do that, we'll have also some deterrent effects of hazard risk. We also reduce the downside risk, manage the downside risk, maybe make some intelligent risk-taking, maximize profitability, and then also have that holistic risk management view, and as well as we have legal and regulatory requirements we'll deal with. So let's take a little deeper dive into some of these. So when we talk about reduced cost of risk, what we're looking at is the total cost incurred by an organization because of the possibility of an accidental loss. In insurance industry, a lot of times you might have heard the term called TCOR, so total cost of risk. And so that's the idea. That's a total cost incurred that includes the training, the third-party administrator, the attorneys, all those type of things. So it has a little more defined down there, a list in there. Cost of accidental losses not reimbursed by insurance will be part of that. The insurance premiums or expenses incurred for non-insurance indemnity. You have the cost of risk control techniques to prevent or reduce the size of accidental losses, as well as the cost of administering the risk management activity. So all those are part of the cost of hazard risk. And if we do our job right and we actually implement some of these things, we'll actually reduce the cost of actually implementing those programs over the long term. Some of the deterrence effects of certainty about potential future accidental losses by making losses less frequent, less severe, and more foreseeable. So besides reducing the cost to implement the programs, hopefully if we're doing the right things, we're actually going to have less losses to deal with, or they'll be less severe. Now, part of when we talk about less severe, what does that mean? Sprinkler systems in a building, they don't prevent a fire, but they actually do make the fire less severe from growing. So that would be a deterrence effect, is actually having some of that equipment. We can reduce downside risk. Some of the examples of that would be like a stop loss limit or some type of trigger that, we have a maximum or it's capped. So that's what a stop loss would be. And that's more of an insurable program. We can manage the downside of risk. So hedging or buying futures. In a lot of these things in the other chapters, when we get to risk financing on 56, we'll talk more about some of that. Southwest did an awesome job of that, about 10, 15 years ago. And eventually all the other airlines caught on. And so they were paying, as oil prices were going up and jet fuel, they were actually paying a much lower cost because of the ability to hedge, other hedging in the oil market. We also have the reduced waste of resources. So if we do it right from an organizational standpoint, the economic impact or a fire or earthquake on loss of production. And if you think about, again, organizations, let's say Toyota or other parts manufacturers, Japan and the impact of the tsunami. A lot of the parts were coming from Japan. So even though we might, from American vehicles, they might have had different components coming there, there's certainly that economic impact. There's a waste of resources that we're not be able to use because of that. So if we can improve on that, that's where we can, it's a benefit to the organization. Improved allocation of productive resources. Organizations are more likely to take risks to be innovators, right? So if we better understand the risk in the environment that we're in, we have insurance, we have controls in place, we're more likely to actually take more risk. So a lot of times risk managers get blamed for saying no. Actually, what I see our job as really is in this new age of risk management is really trying to find ways to say yes. How can we mitigate the risk and help that? And then the last one, at least on this slide, is reduce systemic risk. By doing these things, hopefully, and others are doing the same thing, we can help reduce the possibility of having a complete meltdown of that systemic risk as part of that. The other elements, intelligent risk taking, again, goes back to the innovation aspect, but when we talk about intelligent risk taking, it's that decision making, right? It's getting better data to make those decisions. And it will also help us evaluate our risk appetite and tolerance. So having worked for the university, I'd like to give this example of where within an organization, you might have different risk appetites and tolerance for risk. So if I'm a researcher and university and I want to be the next Nobel Prize winner, I'm really probably willing to take a lot of risk. And so my appetite is quite large, right? That I want to do that. And my tolerance for having things go wrong might be pretty large too. What am I accepting that could happen, right? Now, if I'm an administrator, my risk appetite, yes, I want to be the best, but my tolerance is I don't want to make the newspapers. I don't want to have a death, those type of things. And so that's where there's got to be some give and take. When we talk about intelligent risk taking, is making sure everyone understands the risk associated with it and what's acceptable to be able to evaluate both risk appetite and tolerance. One of the other benefits is we're doing this all right. We're going to maximize profitability, and we'll talk later in this book, the textbook, about optimal risk-adjusted return on capital. The idea is that there's a balance, right? That, as an organization, you can buy insurance for everything now, and it can cost you a lot of money. Well, that's not really a good return on capital if things, based upon the risk, right? We can be spending a whole bunch of money for risk that may not happen. So we really want to look at what are we doing? And really, for most organizations, what you want to do is retain as much risk as possible, right? So what that means is have a high deductible or self-insured retention. So as much as you can self-insure your own risk, you're actually going to have a much better return on capital, because now that those dollars are going to be earning money and a better use the opportunity cost type thing to be able to build more profit. Other benefits, holistic risk management. So hopefully if we're doing this right, we're going to break down silos at all levels and functions. The idea that the risk manager just deals with insurance now and just sits in an office, he or she, and is just dealing with insurance and claims, that's gone. Because if we think about holistic, everyone, the public works, if you're in a government agency or police and fire, they manage risk a certain way, the attorneys do. So everyone's really managing risk. And so we have to have that holistic view to really understand, to basically maximize our profits or not have losses. And then lastly, one of the benefits, if we're doing things right, we're also going to be monitoring our legal and regulatory requirements, because that can be a risk to the organization as well. So switching gears. So we talked about the benefits, to an organization. Again, that's a list of things that's on there. So you want to know and understand that. So I think it said explain. So you want to have that on there. But the benefits of risk management for the economy. So now we're going outside of our own organization and we start looking at that. The economy's cost of risk management includes resources consumed or devoted to combating losses, right? So from a society standpoint, climate change, right? Those are some of the things that we're now looking at. So how do we combat some of those things? Because it's going to affect everyone. It can affect shipping and planes flying and things like that, or oil. All those things, when it's a systemic issue, can certainly impact all organizations. And that when we think about it, the next bullet there, uncertainty throughout the economy causes organizations to be more risk averse. And then you have the next bullet, causes allocation of economy's resources away from assets or activities that seem too risky. So economy is not as productive as it could be. So again, kind of the political environment that we're in, there's in many cases, there's uncertainty, whether it be for farmers, with the having basically workers to work the fields. Partly that's part of the immigration debate. You have tariffs of where should companies be locating as they grow. And a lot of these decisions have to be made now for 2 years out. So how do they allocate those resources? So if I'm not sure what's going on, if I'm a bank, I'm less likely to lend people money, those type of things. So when we have that uncertainty, I'm more likely, I'm just going to kind of hold on to what I know and take the safe bet rather than try to be innovative and expand. Just like with organizations, we'll have a reduced waste of resources. We have improved allocation of productive resources. So again, less uncertainty allows organizations to maximize profits, right? Because we're going to be putting money into those things that we believe will grow. And we also have that reduced systemic risk. And part of how we do that is regulations will help reduce systemic risk. Now there's Dodd-Frank and there's solvency. There's all these different regulatory regulations that we've had. In large part, the only way you can reduce systemic risk is through regulations, right? Because you got to level the playing field, and that's part of what regulations do, and having those things in place. So this is where, as we've talked about that, we've talked a little bit about organizations and what the risks are, but really what risk management, is really focused on objectives, and this is where the new standard, the ISO standard, really focuses on decision-making and why it's so important. And so I'll just read this, but each organization should align its risk management objectives with its overall objectives, all right? So when you think about strategic planning of what does your company do, or your organization, whether it's a public sector or private, what are the objectives? What are you trying to achieve? And whatever those are, the risk management objectives shouldn't be completely off. They should actually align with those. And so part of this, it talks about balancing risk and reward and supporting decision-making. So what the risk manager's job should be, instead of just buying insurance, it should be about how do we achieve the company's objectives? How do we reduce uncertainty so that we can achieve those? So then it goes on, these objectives should reflect the organization's risk appetite and the organization's internal and external context. And this is from the ISO standard as well. And we can emphasize certain goals as business continuity, protection of reputation, or growth. And so when you look at Google or Apple or all these other companies, part of what they're doing is they merge and they're going these new technologies, is they're really focusing on artificial intelligence. And so a lot of the organization's assets and those things are going towards that. That's where the risk appetite is. And if you're a large company with lots of money, you can have more of a risk appetite to do some of those things. You have, you can afford to lose, millions of dollars in trying to get the next big thing. So what I have on the screen is a little bit what I implemented way back when I was with the University of California. So I guess about 6 or 7 years, actually, well, 2010, so 8 years ago. And for those that are familiar with environment, health, and safety, or EHS, is that the traditional view has always been focused on injury prevention or compliance. And so one of the challenges we had when I was there is that, we should be focusing on the risks and how we support the mission. And, the mission of the university, for the most part, is education, research, and public service. It's kind of the three pillars, almost every university: education, research, and public service. And the idea is every dollar that we spend for an injury or accident, those type of things, is taking money away from that mission. Or even any waste, fraud, waste, and abuse would be part of that as well. And so we really changed it up when we said, how does EHS support the UC mission? And health, we can do that by promoting a safe, healthful environment and proactive, cost-effective manner that helps university community minimize their risk, right? So we weren't just focusing on the injuries or compliance aspect. We're really looking at all those things of how the reputational risk, all those type of things are part of it. And so we try to turn the corner. And the University of California, if you get a chance from an enterprise risk standpoint, there's tons of resources on there that I encourage you to look up as ERM, UCOP, space ERM, and you'll find tons of resources on there that can help you with your journey, both from an education standpoint, but then also if your company's looking to do something different. So risk management goals. So on this one, it said, I didn't say list, I'm trying to remember, identify, but I think the goals. So as part of the educational objective here is really to understand the risk management goals and what they mean. Now, these are actually in order. And again, we'll go through each one of them, but the idea of, as a risk manager, your first goal is to have, understand, tolerable uncertainty, right? Can you sleep at night? Do you understand the environment enough that you feel you can sleep at night? The next one is legal and regulatory compliance, right? We understand the risk that we're going to stay in operations. So that's what that tolerable uncertainty is. And then we also want to comply with laws. The next one is survival, right? So if something bad happens, one of our goals is that we'll be able to survive. We'll be able to continue the operations. And eventually then we get to business continuity. Then we want to have get our operations back stable again, that we have things in place. Not only are we, maybe we're down for a bit, but now we want to try to get things back and running. Once we're up and running again, then we can focus on earning stability, right? That we can kind of smooth things out. We're back into earning stability. And eventually after that, we're going to get to profitability and growth, that we can continue to grow. And then because we're growing, now we can be more, have social responsibility, be more focus on some of the environmental issues, things that are going beyond profitability and growth. And lastly is economy of risk management operations, right? And this is where we try to combine everything that we can, that it's efficient and kind of goes back to optimizing, what we're paying there. So kind of going a little more detail, deeper dive. So we talk about tolerable uncertainty is we want to align our risks with an organization's risk appetite. We'll talk about value at risk later on in the textbook. But when we think about risk appetite is, how much are we willing to take on? Again, can we sleep at night? And they define, at least value at risk, and this goes to the dollar amount. So there's the risk appetite of someone getting injured, things like that. But then there's also obviously the monetary aspect. And that's a threshold value that the probability of loss on a portfolio over a given period time horizon exceeds the value and assumes no markets and no trading. And we'll talk about VAR later on, but this is the idea of, how much are you willing to put up? Think about betting, right? Are you willing to buy a lottery ticket, for $1 to win 10,000 or $1 million? Sure. Are you willing to put up $10,000? Right? Well, probably not, because that's your risk appetite. You're not willing to take that chance. Kind of the same idea. Legal and regulatory compliance. So part of this is standard of care that's owed to others. The contracts entered by the organization, as well as federal, state, and local laws. So when we talk about legal and regulatory compliance, there's certain things that we have an obligation to do. Make safe products, right? We have a standard of care in our operations that we don't injure people. If we're in a contract, we're not going to breach that contract. We're going to pay our vendors, those type of things. That's where the legal and regulatory compliance comes into play. Survival. Now, survival is typically assisted by the risk transfer or by an insurance for hazard risk. Again, that's where if you do have a loss, insurance will provide the financial aspect back there. But survival can also mean how do we, competition, new technology, how do we stay up there? Examples where some organizations haven't done this, like Kodak, where Sears was in the news recently. The basic Sears was the Amazon of their day back in the 1930s with their catalogs and things like that. So again, how do we survive, or how organizations continue to survive? That should be part of their goals. Business continuity. So once we survive, identify activities whose operations cannot be tolerated, meaning going down. Identify types of accidents that would interrupt services, and identify the availability of standby resources. When I worked for Raley Supermarkets many years ago, probably 15, or actually longer than that, one of the things we had an issue was in the warehouse, the battery changer. Well, if anyone knows anything about warehouse operations, forklifts and pallet jacks are the lifeblood of those. And basically, part broke on the battery puller for the battery rack, and that part was going to take 72 hours to get to arrive, and so that's basically millions of dollars a day being lost because of that part. And so there's a lot of times, sometimes a bottleneck or those type of things, and that's where again that standby resources comes into play for that business continuity. Understand what could keep your operations from continuing. That rest on their earning stability, that's self-explanatory, profitability and growth, social responsibility, and then the economy risk management operations. Really what we're talking about there is you can buy insurance for anything. Issue is how much will it cost? And so, do you really want to spend money on all that insurance and you're not going to make a profit? So that's where that balance comes into play when you look at all these things of how much risk and uncertainty are you willing to take on for that. And the reality is there's trade-offs among the goals. You can't do everything. And that's also one of the messages part of this. So again, you want to make sure you know the list of the various risk management goals for the exam. Now getting to measuring risk. So when we look at basic measures that apply to risk management, typically we're going to talk about an exposure, the volatility. Again, we'll go into detail on these: likelihood, consequences, time horizon, correlation. It's a list. Typically, it's going to be on the exam, so you'll have a question: which one of these are basic measures that are measured that apply to risk management? And these are one of the things that would probably be in the list, or and you identify which one does not belong, or something like that. So, what's the definition? So, an exposure: it's any condition that presents a possibility of a gain or loss, or whether or not an actual loss occurs. So I drive a car, therefore I have an exposure to get in an auto accident. Doesn't mean I actually have had one. It's just that the condition is present because I have it. So we think about all the exposures. Most of your organizations have many, human capital, all those types of exposures. And typically based upon exposure, there's a line of coverage in many cases. But just as we've talked about that not everything's insurable, you need to think about what's your exposure to your operations, your reputation, things like that. Volatility, which basically means frequent fluctuations. It's basically going up and down. The stock market going up and down. Oil prices. Some things are more volatile than others. So that's one of the issues we have when we talk about risk. Likelihood. So likelihood of an occurrence can include mathematical probability based upon the law of large numbers. Right. The idea that with the more data we have a better idea to understand the likelihood. And this is where actuaries come into play as well, based upon data. They can predict pretty well life expectancy and all those type of things. And that's why the actuarial tables of why rates go up at a certain age based upon smoking, all those things can help us determine likelihood much better. The consequences, so degree to which an occurrence could positively or negatively affect an organization. The time horizon, a way to estimate duration, and then correlation is a relationship between variables. You might wonder why time horizon is important. When we talk about risk, again, there's a volatility now. You can say the climate change has created more volatility, at least in weather patterns and things like that. But the time horizon we also have for certain events is important to know based upon the exposure. So if you think about wildfires, fire starts, you don't have a huge time horizon. You have a potential for, a wildfire with high winds, dry, low humidity, all those type of things, right? And whereas with a hurricane, you have several days, you can see it forming. So you have a longer time horizon to basically prepare for that exposure, right? That can happen there. Now, one of the things that's interesting, at least on the time horizon, one of the challenges that in California, there's, for those that follow the news, Pacific Gas and Electric, PG&E, made the decision recently to basically institute new protocols because there's been several wildfires caused by down power lines, or maybe they're down or whatever, but they were touching and they've caused a couple wildfires. So they've actually made the decision now during extreme winds, red flag warnings, and low humidity, those type of things in which the Weather Service issued it, that they basically shut people, over 80,000 residents' power off. Now, that was a risk management decision that they made based upon the potential of having a future wildfire. Not popular decision. Schools had to shut down, all those type of things. But if you think about with their data, they probably have some data models, things like that, that they had to make a decision that would they rather pay billions of dollars in a wildfire claim or have a lot of upset customers with having to shut down the operations or power for 12 hours. Now, when we talk about risk, again, this is a figure that I think is real helpful to kind of look at it. We have risk and, the kind of two sides of the risk pendulum. You have pure risk and you have speculative risk. Now, if you look over on your left-hand side and you look at the screen, you see pure, objective, and diversifiable. And that defines basically the best, that's an insurable risk. The idea that it's pure, it can happen or not happen. It's objective. It's something that it's the likelihood or, based upon, car accidents, things like that, they, the probability of the law of large numbers, they can have pretty objective. It's not something to where people are more likely or systemic type of issues. And it's diversifiable, meaning that they can insure to other things and not others. And so that becomes a great insurable product. And so that's why you see property, auto, workers' comp, all those things, is they have a pretty good idea of what the risks are based upon the type of client. When we get into subjective, the subjective risk, where people can, decide, breach of contracts, those type of things, it becomes a little more challenging there. And we get on speculative risk on that side of the aisle. Now what we're talking about is really stock market. It's more financial type of aspects, objective, diversifiable. So you can kind of see the pattern of really that one leg that you have is really the only area that's really truly insurable, but insurance does look at the others. Again, definitions at the bottom: speculative risk, a chance of loss, no loss, or potential gain. That's why that's financial. Whereas pure risk is really just a chance of loss or no loss, but there is no chance of gain. When we look at some of the speculative risks and investments, talks a little bit more in detail about, you have market risk, inflation risk, interest rate risk, and liquidity risk. And so when you think about the different types of risk, right, the risk associated with fluctuations in prices, financial securities, such as stocks and bonds, so that's the market. Inflation risk, we're starting to see inflation risk. Well, that's where, the Fed comes in and starts raising interest rates. So then you have on the flip side, the interest rate risk that, securities future value based on charges and the changes in the interest rate. It also means, can people actually pay their bills, becomes part of that. And that's also some of the liquidity risk, right? So you have all these things when we talk about speculative risks. And going back to the market meltdown, 2008 with the mortgage industry, obviously you had a lot of market risk because you had, all the derivatives that were out there. Inflation risk was, I don't think, too bad at that point. But then interest rates, were low, but you basically had this whole condition where people couldn't pay their bills. And when they couldn't pay their bills, they defaulted, they went bankrupt, those type of things. So the homes got foreclosed. And so all those become part of that. So subjective risk, this is more detail. Perceived amount of risk based on individuals or organization's opinion, whereas objective risk is measurable variation and uncertain outcomes based on facts and data, right? And the key point here is the closer an organization's subjective interpretation of risk is to objective risk, the more effective its risk management plan will likely be. So the idea being the perceived amount of risk based upon my opinion, is that I might believe that there's a higher risk of auto accidents or flying or whatever. That's subjective. But if I look at the data, that's, if my opinion aligns more with the objective area, then we'll have a much more effective risk management plan to be able to deal with that. So that's where a lot of companies buy insurance that they don't need because it's subjective. It may not be based on objective information, but they just perceive that that there's a concern there, and so they might buy extra areas. So why do we have the differences, right? Familiarity and control. Air travel versus driving cars, right? There's that perception that air travel, at least it was, maybe not so much anymore, is unsafe. You're more likely to get killed, those type of things, versus driving a car. The reality is we have many more car accidents every day and more people killed in car accidents than we've ever had with air travel. Consequences over likelihood, right? There's zero probability versus low probability. Now, it can't happen to me type of aspect. So that's where the subjectivity comes in, where people maybe don't wear seatbelts, something like that. Again, that's where the subjective versus objective. Overstating a low probability event, can be due to media event or knowing someone that has had it happen to them, right? Usually when there's some big story, right, the media may hype it up, and so then people, get worried. So examples might be, talking about, maybe a foodborne illness outbreak. Well, then, they're really hyping it that someone got sick, and then all of a sudden it seems like everyone got sick, but it was really more of an isolated case. But that overstating that local probability now makes people more concerned. And then risk awareness. There's also the aspect of what we call the ostrich defense. There's a lot of, I would say, in some cases, risk managers or compliance folks that don't want to know what their risks are, with the idea being, well, from a defense standpoint, it's probably better that I don't know what's going on, so they don't do a risk assessment. And talking to litigation attorneys, that's actually the worst thing. They much rather know what the risks were and that they were to be prioritized and the reason why, than just to say, well, I know nothing, when you should have known nothing, because that's not defense. And especially for large organizations, they really should be aware of the risk, and that would be a standard of care and expectation that they would know those. So we talk about diversifiable versus non-diversifiable risk. A risk that affects only some individuals, businesses, or small groups. So a building fire affects several buildings, that'd be diversifiable. The non-diversifiable is really that systemic, or affects a large segment. So earthquakes, hurricanes, flood, mortgage industry, those are non-diversifiable, right? An earthquake impacts everyone. It's not just one little home. And so that's why earthquake coverage, again, is a little more expensive or hard to get, is because as an insurance organization, do I really want to take on a risk of earthquake in California when I'm going to be paying out a whole bunch of claims? It just doesn't make good business sense. Or if they do it, they're going to have to charge a lot of money. And so that's why you have the California Earthquake Authority basically being the one that fronts that. Same thing with national flood insurance, things like that. And then as well as you had terrorism coverage for insurance companies. They needed the federal government to basically be the backstop for terrorism coverage. So the quadrants of risk, we kind of looked at this before, hazard, operational, financial, and strategic. But when we look at this, we really want to look at the quadrants and where these things fall into play. And from a test taking standpoint, this is one of those figures that you want to be able to explain and understand. And this will, if you can do that, then you'll do just fine on this portion of the test. So we look at the quadrants: hazard risk, property, liability, or personnel losses, and then defines them in that little pie segment there. Property risk, legal, personnel, and consequential loss might be there. Then operational risk, that's where we're talking about people, right? And we talk about people risk, it's human capital. Can we get the right people to, that are skilled to do our jobs? It could be IT risk, management oversight, some business processes. And if you look at that line, the pure risks above it. So these are pure risks, right, are going to be much more likely to be insurable when we look at some of those aspects, right? Speculative risk on the bottom half, now we're looking at financial risk, market risk, credit risk. These are all systemic issues, much more speculative. We don't know what's going to happen. We have less control over that, as well as strategic risk, and it rises from trends in the economy and society. So part of that is the economic environment, political, demographics, competition. Now, one of the things I really try to get risk managers to look at is when we talk about risk, especially when we talk about things other than insurable risk, like the hazard risk, is focus on the source of risk and who manages the risk. So going back to the operational risk, Who manages people risk? Well, typically it's your HR, it's your personnel department. IT is going to be your IT manager or director. Political or economic environment or demographics or strategic risk, typically that's your board of directors in most cases. Market risk, financial risk, that's going to be, in most cases, your CFO aspect. And so there's different people that manage the risk for you. And so it's not just the risk manager. The risk manager is much more in this idea, this kind of paradigm shift of this evolution, is much more of a coach and facilitator than the one that's going to be expected to actually manage each one of these things. And it's really helping those people that manage risk on a daily basis to do their job better. So back to the definitions. So I don't think this was in the textbook. This is the old one, so I put it up. Some of the definitions, but the effect, definition of risk based on ISO 31000 has the old version, 2009, but still has not changed, is the effect of uncertainty on objectives. And if you read these others, possibly an event will occur, adversely affect the achievement of objectives, talk about outcomes that can either improve. But the main thing is that if you look at all these things, they're all talking about objectives, right? It's tying risk to the objectives. And then even definitions of risk management. Again, coordinated activities, directing, control, and organization with regard to risk. COSO looks at identification, assessment, and response to risk to a specific objective. So all these things are really looking at, how do we approach it? And the definition in the book of risk management, an approach to managing all of an organization's key business risks and opportunities with the intent of maximizing shareholder value, also known as enterprise-wide risk management. So when we talk about opportunities, again, they don't say it in there, but it's really looking at objectives and how can we make better decisions to meet the objectives. So again, I'm putting stuff from the old textbook, but I think it's valuable and gives you a good foundation. We looked at definition, and there's a book called Against the Gods. It's more of the history of the risk management. Very easy read. But the main thing that to kind of get from this is that, what it talks about is the essence of risk management lies in maximizing the areas where we have some control over the outcome while minimizing the areas where we have absolutely no control over the outcome and linkage between effect and causes hidden from us. Now, the reason I bring this up is that a lot of times we talk about mitigating or controlling risk, risk control aspect, but there's many cases where we actually over control risk. There's some cases where we can under control risk. And it kind of has to do with that subjective aspect of risk of what we perceive to happen. So, can you over control or treat a certain risk? And I would say when I was with the university, one of the things that eventually identified as an over controlled risk was actually the earthquake program. Most of the buildings were already seismically braced, all those type of things, and yet more money was being spent. But the marginal rate of return of doing more and more and more things on addressing that risk, as far as how they're supporting the objectives, the building is going to stay up, people are going to survive. There's only so much you can do, and for the earthquake example. So it's always going to be a huge risk, but there's only so much you can do is kind of the lesson there. But and then the idea is using those resources of moving those to risks that are under, that are not controlled as well. And so, and I would say there's much more examples of under controlling risk, right? Buying new equipment, ergonomic equipment, things that can make things more productive. So those type of aspects, we can find examples much more easily, probably than over controlled risk. And this is the definition: an approach to managing all an organization's key business risks and opportunities with the intent of maximizing shareholder value. Same thing in there. And this is where we start looking at some of the differences, right? So enterprise risk management encompasses both hazard risk and business risk. Traditional risk management focuses only on hazard risk, right? We've been saying this all night long. Enterprise risk management seeks to enable an organization to fulfill its greatest productive potential. Traditional risk management seeks to restore an organization to its former pre-loss condition. When we talk about pre-loss, it means financial condition. That's all that's really doing. Enterprise risk focuses on the value of the organization, whereas traditional risk management focuses on the value of the accidental loss. And then as well, last one, enterprise risk management focuses on the organization as a whole, whereas traditional risk management focuses on specific loss exposures. And one of the things I think that's happened with the insurance industry is it's really caused the silos that we have now, right? Because we have workers' comp coverage and property and general liability and all these other things. But the reality is when most risks actually impact all lines of coverage. And so we've kind of segmented these things. And so when we look at things of how does, again, enterprise focus on the organization as a whole, we start breaking down those silos and understanding what's the value to the organization, not just on focusing on how we're going to repay this accident that occurred on the job. In the definition of ERM that's in the book, right, we've already talked about this, but this is something that you just be able to know the different definitions. And then some of the theoretical pillars of ERM, and I didn't put this in there, kept it in from the last textbook, because I think it's valuable. If you think about all ERM definitions, include the concept of managing an organization's risk to help meet its objectives. You may have already heard the term, but ERM for others besides enterprise risk means everyone is a risk manager. And I think that's really true. And if you think about when we talk about risk management, ERM, even though it's a concept, they talk about it, risk management today is ERM. The idea that risk managers are only buying insurance and doing that traditional, I think those days are long gone. And so that's part of hopefully why you're also taking this course. And if, as an example that I assume it's still up is UC Irvine Risk Summit video. If you take a look at that, use that link, and that's a nice little video I think you'll enjoy. So other pillars, part of the ERM, that go along with this idea is the interdependency, right? Traditional risk assumes that risks are unrelated, right? And that goes back to that silo idea, the workers' comp coverage and all that. Well, ERM really tries to break down the silos of management. Everything's really tied together. There's also correlation as one of the pillars, right? Correlation increases risk. So the idea of location of your suppliers, again, using Japan way back with Fukushima, and you think about other locations that are having issues due to natural disaster, all those things, there's a correlation that will certainly increase risk. And lastly, the other pillar is portfolio theory. That idea that portfolio is a combination of risks and their interactions with other risks, right? So if you have an earthquake, you're going to have property damage, but you're also going to have workers' comp from people there and maybe visitors. All those type of things will probably tie in together. Business interruption, all those things. So the portfolio is a combination and how each one of those interacts to be able to understand those. Now, when we also think about traditional risk management, there's typically a structure associated with it. And this is what you typically see in a traditional risk management department. You have a risk management director, maybe you have someone's in charge of insurance, you have your safety and loss prevention manager, and then you'll have your claim manager. And so this is your traditional view of what you most likely would see probably 20 years ago. Really what you're seeing now is, from a governance model, where does risk management sit? It's all over the place, right? So really you should have a board of directors, the CEO reports to the board, and you're finding a lot more boards have a risk committee or a GRC or governance risk and compliance committee might be part of that. And then below that is you have a chief risk officer or executive risk committee or whatever that might be that reports to the CEO as well as to the board. And underneath that you have line managers, really the risk managers, it's a dotted line, right? It's not a straight line structure where there's, direct accountability. But the idea is that now that chief risk officer or risk manager, depending on the size of the organization, is really helping coach and facilitate. Kind of goes back to it, that the risk manager can't do everything. They need the risk owners to actually help them manage the risk and bring those risks up to leadership from the bottom up. So the challenges in implementing ERM, as well as what you need to have. So the first one from implementation, senior leadership support. Enterprise risk data. Actually, when we talk about risk data, you need a system as well. That's one of the ideas of a risk management information system. Have risk management processes that are integrated, again, not that siloed approach. And also risk managers with authority to make and enforce changes and effective communication, right? So these are some of the items that they talk about in the book that if you're going to look to implement, you really need to have. These are some of the core elements you need to have there. Well, and what are the challenges and the impediments to be able to implement an ERM? The biggest one is technology to share data across the system or dashboards, right? So that's becoming easier with business intelligence software, those type of things. But there's so much data out there. So what data do you need to share? And the idea of HR information and operations and all that, whereas risk managers traditionally dealt with loss runs and loss data, what you're finding is risk managers are actually dealing with sales data. If you're university student enrollment, the number of dorms, and because there's a property issue with the number of dorms, so property risk, all this type of information really needs to be combined, and then you can actually really have a much more holistic view of risk. And then part of the other impediments, blowing up silos, right? The idea that risk management buys insurance, HR is responsible for benefits, finance manages investments and operations production, all those things. Really, again, that's where we want to share the data and see how all these things actually interconnect. So we actually went through the entire chapter. And so what do you want to get out of this today? Hopefully, the first thing, using traditional risk management techniques with technology can provide more certainty to risk management decisions. Another takeaway, effective risk management benefits both the organization and the economy, and be able to understand what those benefits are. Risk management program provides a framework for planning, organizing, leading, and controlling resources and activities. And finally, traditional risk management focuses on hazard risk, and ERM focuses on operational, financial, strategic, in addition to hazard risk. So with that, I want to thank everyone for attending. Look forward to your questions. You can certainly email questions to me using the comment section, and or as well as the chat that's online. So thank you everyone for attending, and I'll look forward to next week. Have a great night.